again, I guess, all right. Something has changed, but it'll be okay. The spontaneous self-creation of Ray, who came into being on his own, because of his own, and Ray is the son of Nu, meaning the son of that inert, frozen, watery mass of cosmic chaos. But he's the son that is greater than the father because of there is progress in creation. Then we looked a little bit at how Ray became coincidentally manifest and hidden in the creation of Shu and Tefnut, who were born as a consequence of his swallowing his own masturbation, which was another way of talking about externalization in the creative process that is a self-generative process. And last time we began talking a little bit about the mythology, philosophy, and religion of the free Meson, meaning the children of light. And we're talking now about the children of light and the center of that children of the religion of light being Ray. And that by looking at the source of the light and by looking at the changes in the light is the way we come to know the truth of the spirit of Ray in that whole process. So what we looked at last time was Ray passing through the Tuat, through the underworld. How Ray is darkened and obscured and in great danger in his struggle with Apep, and how he is protected by various gods, and how Ray is redeemed both by the prayers of the of people and by the protection of the gods, and eventually as a result of his own activities. Then, after looking at the Tuat, we saw Ray rising out of the Tuat as the rising sun, and we had some pictures of Ray bent over backwards, filled with energy and pouring out new light into day. We started looking, last time we got together, we started looking at the day side of the cycle, the bright apparent side. And we looked at Ray, or Amun-Ra, as the hawk of the noonday sun. We'll spend all of the rest of this evening looking at the threefold sides to Ray as the stations of the day. But Ray, at any rate, climbs to this hawk-like majesty, soars there, and when at the height of the Empyrean, he dives down, back down to earth on his enemy Apep, the serpent of darkness. So that's the mighty Ray, Ray of the midday when everything is warm, and it's Ray of midsummer when everything is hot and the light is at its most extreme. Now, most of this year, we've been talking about the nature of divinity being threefold, and the necessity for that, for the universal nature of spirit to become manifest or to be understood by those within the manifestation, that threefoldness is necessary as the simplest possible way of understanding that unity. Can't be understood any other way. And we've said that the Egyptians are no different than the Hindus or the Christians in referring to this threefold nature of the divine. And we've been looking at various threefold spiritual foci to do that. Re as the creator of light, that is the creator of truth, the creator of life, and the creator of love, is no exception to this. Re is the intelligence behind our being and the intelligibility on which each of our self-beings can become by partaking of that intelligibility. And so we're now looking at the threefold nature of Re in the day. So we've looked at Re or Amun Re, and now let's look at some other things. It's good to start looking at the high ideal, the center, the brightest of the bright, but each of the attributes of the daytime ray is very different. If, for example, we go out, especially if you've been staying up all night or a good part of the night, and you see the sunrise, and then you work all day, or you're involved in the activities of the day, and you see the sun set. There is a gigantic difference, not just because of what you've experienced, but that's a large part of it, but there's a gigantic difference between the feeling of a sunrise and of a sunset. In one case, the sunrise, there is the feeling of everything has been dark and dreary and dead, and suddenly there is the promise of new light, and then it comes splashing in, and then there's the whole day before you. And then there's the sentiment of the sunset, and when things are going down and quieting down, and you've had all of the experience of the day, all of the necessities, the emergencies, and everything else that take place in day, and then you know that you can relax and you can sort of sink back into yourself with the sunset and look back at everything that has taken place, and you can see that with a greater wisdom by looking back after it's all done. Now, this is a cycle or a circle that we see every day. And we've said before in a very symbolic way that the circle represents God. It's centered, it's endless, and it can roll on. Every place in the spiritual circle or in the spiritual sphere, the center is everywhere, and the radius is all radiuses at the same time, because in that realm of consciousness there is no differentiation to position in space or extension in space. It's all just one. But for us, the ring or the circle or the wheel are nice symbols. But there's much, much more to it than that, because if we look at the circle as a cycle, because if we watch day by day, the sun rises, it reaches its height, and then it sets. And this goes on day by day by day. But each stage of that diurnal cycle has a quality about it. It has a mood about it. It has a truth in its very existence. And each one of those moments of existence is an important truth in the terms of the light. The same is true if we expand the cycle to a month and all of the things that take place in the stages of a month or a year, from spring to spring or from midwinter to midwinter. In that cycle, we recognize that there's a whole, like right now, there's a great expectancy of new life and warmth, and things are going to just grow like crazy, and so we're looking forward to that. And this is, so the year is the whole. The day is the whole. They are each representations of a moment that is expanded to us in a longer sense. So that if we see the circle or if we see the cycle, if we can take the whole year as we do in our annual retrospection at New Year's, which is Christmas Eve, and we look at the whole year and we can sum it up as one, that is like trying to sum up the whole nature of the divine as it is rhythmically and harmonically, repeatedly unfolding itself throughout the whole stage of the cycle. You could say the same thing for human life. What is a human? Is a human most in self when they're born as an infant with infinite potential? Or are they a decrepit old person who has lots of experience and lots of wisdom but no vigor? Or is there some special age that you are you? Any cycle is a statement of a whole oneness. And I think that's, if we can just conceive that whole thing in itself, that concept in itself, that instead of looking at things in a linear fashion where we try to look at one day after another day after another day, or if we look at it in a punctilious fashion where we look at one moment or 1 minute of the day and say that's the whole day. Now, it's not a convenient representation of the divine to look at a cycle. It is a necessary representation. The whole wheel of our existence, day by day, month by month, year by year, is considered the wheel of necessity. In most metaphysical systems, it's carried into being a wheel or a circle of rebirths, where we come back to birth again and again. And on the cosmic level, it's the whole cycle of everything that is in existence is born again out of that turgid, frozen abyss, to go through a grand and glorious creation and to return to a cosmic sleep again. It's a necessary cycle. And the wheel is turned by the spontaneous love of Ray or of God, or the every day when we have to get out of bed and say, do I want to go to work today? Do I want to do things? Each time this is a spontaneous act of love. But of course there's some necessity, because we have made commitments. I have to go to work tomorrow and fight with the wiring people. I've made commitments to do that. No matter what, I have to be there. Now, some people feel that the wheel of necessity is a grand limitation. That once we have cause and consequence at the two ends of the rotating diameter, that it is nothing but a monotonous, boring cycle of causes and consequences, and that we can't ever get anywhere, and that the wheel of necessity, being on it, it's sort of like being on the wheel of Ixon, that you must roll forever and ever, being stretched out like on a rack or something like that, and there's no the only goal is to free yourself or liberate yourself from the wheel, but that is utterly spiritual nonsense. Most of the spiritual life, even in the metaphysical sense, is a matter of attitude. It is not only a wheel of necessity, there is a necessity to the wheel. There is something about our basic being. What we are, we have to give. What we are is divine. And we have to have progress. Truly, if the most remarkable people that we know, comparing ourselves even to somebody that's just a little above us, those people are progressive. We admire the fact that they learn from their mistakes and that they're doing new things and that they're going forward. We need something new. We need experience. We need to give. So that being on the wheel of necessity is not just being tied to something. It is a way of satisfying something that is basically good in our being, and it is a I don't know how to say it. It's a divine urge that all of what we live in and that we recognize as so blessed is something that is necessary for us to do. You know, like if you do somebody a favor and you really want to do something for somebody, you want to help them out or do something like that, they're so thankful that you've done something, and they don't realize that you're just as thankful for the opportunity to have done something. And that is the same with the divine point of view, that it's just so great to do this, it's too good to not do. And so there is a deeper necessity, and that deeper necessity is both to experience and to give ourselves to experience. And there's no better way that it can be stated than to say to bring light to more darkness, because in that darkness there is potential. So there is really a different, a much deeper meaning to when people say, yes, this will come about just as surely as night follows day. Because that's really what happens, and people, you can rely on this and you can count on this, and it isn't because of some kind of autonomy, but it is because of some kind of very wise, rhythmic fulfillment of a creative love. All right. So, in Egypt, as in Christianity, we see a resurrection of light. And we see it from a realm where death would certainly be if it were to continue. And so there is an ascension each day out of the realm of the dead, out of the realm of darkness into the realm of light. This is the thing that characterized Egyptian religion. It's the thing that characterizes all mysticism, but it seems that the Egyptians brought that to the fore more than anywhere else, which is one of the reasons why Christianity caught on in Egypt like almost no other place. In fact, it was fused because that whole idea not only of spiritual resurrection, but of material resurrection was right within the Egyptian religion. So that in Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the head of the United Nations, would know exactly what we're talking about because he is a Coptic Christian, one of the descendants of the Coptic Gnostics. And the Coptic Gnostics literally had what is called, you can still get copies of it yet, they're only used copies, very well used, and they're expensive, maybe $200 or $300, but you can get a book of the Ethiopian Book of the Dead. And the Ethiopian Book of the Dead is like a direct transition of all of the ancient Egyptian ideas into the not only the modern language, but the modern conceptology of Christ. So this is something that in our modern Christ religion, that is a religion that transcends all the materialism and symbolism of the ancient times. It is found in all of those things. It isn't something that does away with it. So there is a distinct character to the rising sun that is altogether different than the noonday sun, or altogether different than the setting sun, and certainly different than darkness. And it is so significant, the difference between the rising sun from everything else, that the Egyptians had a separate name for it, and a separate divinity. And that divinity was called Khepra. And that divinity, as part of the whole cycle, was Re Khepra. Now, that brings us to an interesting side trip. We're going to have loads of side trips over the next few weeks, especially if I do all the things I want to do. And that is the concept that comes up in That is the concept that comes up in our material realm. And that is almost an ideal for us. And it's because of our weakness and our feebleness that we understand it. In the material realm, we get to see things in a stopped action state. That refrigerator looks like it's standing there in a stopped action state. A lot of things, if we, like the famous graph of the rising and setting of the sun in its declination, those are actually noonday positions in stopped action of the sun over an entire year. This is declination and versus time. And in our material consciousness in this world, we look at things through stopped action. And that is something, by looking at something when it's stopped and when it's not moving, we come to an objectivity. So, the objectivity about the sunrise, or the light of the sunrise, or the light of spring, or the quality of spring, was so distinct and it was understood so clearly that it was given a name that was all of its own, and it was given a divine quality that was all its own, and that was called Khepra. Now, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about Hindu mythology. We noted in Hindu mythology that divinities or qualities of the divine took various incarnations as various avatars, or that the same principle was found in distinct gods and goddesses. But those were one thing going through many gyrations. There were a few cases of the same being existing quotaneously as distinctly different beings. Probably the most notable of all of those was Parvati. If you remember Parvati, the counter goddess of Shiv, was also known as Kali, or was also known as Durga, or Annapurna, or Devi. They were all the same being. Now, the first temptation is to consider this the result of idolatry and of materialism, saying that people get fixated on something and they turn it into an idol, and that is all there is to it. That somebody sees the divine in one way, and they're so insecure that in their insecurity they want it to stay that way all the time and be that one thing, and they will then give their religious obeisance to it and dwell within it. There really is, sometimes that's the case, that there is that kind of rigid sectarianism and that separatism. But I think there is also a deeper side to it, and we're going to go back to some themes that we've looked at before, and I'm going to try and carry them a little bit further. If you remember, about 2 years ago, we were talking about Egypt again at that time. We were talking about mystery myths, and we talked about the mystery myth of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And we said that Osiris had been cut up into 13 parts, and that those 13 parts were distributed in various different places. And we also talked about it with Orpheus being ripped into pieces, and we talked about it especially with Dionysus being torn into pieces, and each of those pieces was alive. And that principle of the universal truth being ripped into pieces, each of which is alive, and being ripped into pieces to obtain specific ends, we call the principle of distribution. It was the principle that was used by the Platonists. This is a very different thing than we talked about a few weeks ago when we were talking about karma. We talked about the creation, the way the divine creates, the way God and the gods create, is by compounding various unities, by derivation and compounding. They're two very different qualities. One is taking many, many universals and compounding them into one, and one is taking a oneness and separating them into various different ways. So in the phenomenal realms, all creation or generation would probably be the better word. All generation of new things comes about as a consequence of separation and differentiation. All creation, in the spiritual sense, comes about as a consequence of unifying and compounding and fusing together individual ideas. Okay. We're going to talk again about the principle of distribution. We know very well from the works of a composer or from the works of a painter or even someone who plays chess that if you have one idea, from that one idea many, many different thoughts and applications can be distinctly separated. One idea produces many, many, many different thoughts. It's always amazing when you get into a physics class and you're given one simple principle or one simple formula and all of the really different things that you can get out of it. And each of them applies to the reality that we live in. This is probably the example of distribution that we see most commonly. That is one principle forming many, many thoughts and those thoughts being the driving engines behind the phenomena that we see in the physical world around us. Each of these thoughts, in turn, can be differentiated into a whole field of emotions. Each thought we can have all kinds of different feelings about. If a stone bops us on the head, our feelings about gravity are very different than if the comparative density, the gravity holds together a wisp of odor from a flower and it stays concentrated for us. That's a rather pleasant feeling that we have about gravity in those moments. So each thought is capable of engendering activity into any number of emotions or motivations or desires or feelings. In turn, each one of those feelings can produce all kinds of actions. For example, if you take dance and we'll go to a dance floor and see how many different people are dancing in different ways to the same piece of music. All of those actions, some people will interpret it very roughly and some people will interpret it very smoothly. Any feeling then can lead to a great number of actions. One objective, the scorer with a basketball, can produce all kinds of actions, all kinds of moves, all kinds of things like that. And each of these results into a material experience. Of course, there's a great problem. There has to be a follow-through. The will that takes the idea and differentiates a thought from it, and then from that thought awakens a feeling, and from that feeling an action, so that there's finally an impact or a form that comes out of it. It requires a lot of follow-through in order to do that. Now, we can see then that one idea results in many, many, many unique distributions. But at each step along the way, things become more unique. If we chose this thought rather than that thought, and this desire off of that thought, it becomes more unique. And the further it becomes differentiated, the further it is from the unity. And the more likely there is of an ignorance, likelihood there is with the consciousness going into all of the realms of the differentiations, into the realms of deeper and deeper or more diverse manifestations of distribution, the more likelihood there is to ignorance. It's coming more and more into the realm of darkness, into the realm of apepi. But there's something extremely, extremely valuable in this. The distribution we have seen now is something that is within our experience. When we think and finally experience something in a material sense, that's only one kind of distribution. We ourselves, in our personal natures, we as beings, physical beings, have built right within us the ability to act and the ability to experience all of those feelings and the ability to think. We as unique personalities are ourselves distributions. In the same way that once Ray was born, all of the Rays were born, you can say that once distribution has begun, see, once we became thinking beings, we produced a whole bunch of distributions. So we are a part and a agency of the whole principle of distribution. Becoming what we are in our really limited sense, in our being as limited human beings, each step in our differentiation, we have become more and more and more complex. Just in our physical body alone, we have several billion cells. And at each step of this complexity, we have become more ignorant of what we are. And we've become more focused outwardly from a universal inward unity that we began as a focus of light, the very same light that lights up our minds when we have an idea. We have come from that light into greater and greater outer darkness, and we've been distracted into more and more and more complexity, and so much so that we see only little snippets of light in all the things around us, and in our loneliness and in our lostness, we often grasp at those little snippets in order to satisfy the loneliness because we see a little bit of light there. The eventual awareness of all of these distinct things around us, and, like when we see each thing around us as something separate, something different, we've been distracted and in love with it enough to tell the difference one from another, just the same way that the little prince could tell one rose from all of the other roses in the cosmos because he had learned to love that one rose. Our awareness of all of the distinct distributions happening at the same time that we are lonely, very, very lonely, and being turned in because we're overwhelmed, we're smothered, covered over almost like grains in a granary where everything turns inward and gets hot. We have been turned inward, and in this process of turning inward with the consciousness of distinction of separate objects, we have awakened to a unique spiritual individuality. This unique spiritual individuality is a replica, is an image of the divinity of the One. When we come to know ourselves as ones, we then are related to the One of the whole business. So, gradually, as we turn inward, we have the strength to be outward and not to be overwhelmed by the confusion of all other things, but we can discover, and the more we discover ourselves, the more we discover the distributions in the world. And we get to see the uniqueness of them and to love them and care about them. And spiritual individuality is thus connected with everything, and the universality, the oneness, is rediscovered between all of these disparate things that have been separated. Because all of them are still alive. All of the pieces of Dionysus, or like all of the pieces of Osiris, if you sew them back together, Osiris comes back to life again. So, there is a process then of distinctly knowing self. Like one knows all the stages of light during the day, and of knowing all of the differentiations in the world at the same time. This is something that has stayed with the Mideast. It's amazing how much Arabic thought is strongly influenced by ancient Egyptian thought. Even the pronunciations of words and things like that come straight out of Egypt, even though they hated Egypt and did everything they could to decimate all of the temples and everything else. The Library of Alexandria, everything. Who was wanting to know the date of that? Was it you that was wanting to know? It was 640. That was the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. We had a discussion in the store here a few weeks ago. That wasn't you, all right? AD. It existed about 900 years. So this process then is a process of objectification. And the more we objectify outward, the more things that we can differentiate, just like it happens in recapitulation in every child. A child gets to know the difference between a bear and a bunny, and it gets to know every item in the kitchen, and it gets eventually to know every tree. This is something that gets reproduced in every light. This process is that the greater the objectification of things is externally, the greater there is the strengthening and objectification of the unique individuality within. This is an ongoing and progressive activity. I want to look at that a little bit in detail and try to get at what objectivity and awakening means, or I want to understand distribution a little bit more. And let's do that by looking at something that we see every week, something like the eraser. If you look at it like this, it's a line. If you look at it in some ways, it becomes a diamond. If you look at other ways, it becomes a rectangle. There are almost an infinite number of points of view that you can look at any single simple object. This is about as simple an object as you can get. And if we could, as we eventually will be able to do, if we could look at it a whole bunch of ways very fast, if we looked at all angles as fast as we could twist the eraser in our mind, we could see the eraser as a total objectivity in all states, all at the same time. We can actually, in our spiritual consciousness, when we progress, when we practice each day an inward concentration, we can learn to look at something from a number of points of view at the same time, and eventually we can expand to the consciousness where we see a thing from all points of view at the same time, even interpenetrating ones, but I don't want to get too complex about it. We reach a total objectivity. At that same time, we reach an objectivity about ourselves, where we see ourselves with a whole bunch of points of view at the same time. Now, in this, we can look at families of objectivities. Let's take the basic family that we've been looking at all year: father, mother, and son. A triangle. But there are a family of triangles that proceed all the way from something like this So not only can we can look at this triangle, and we can look at that triangle from many, many points of view. But that triangle is itself part of an almost infinite number of a family of triangles. So eventually, in our consciousness, we should not only be able to see a triangle, but we should be able to see that triangle as part of a whole family of triangles. A few years ago in an astrology class, we looked at this as a principle of family of aspects. There are trapezoidal. So we see our triangle from many points of view, and we see it as part of a family of triangles. But there are some of these triangles that are special. And they're special either internally or externally. Like if we look, there is only one equilateral triangle out of all of the family of all of the myriad of triangles that there could be. There is only one right triangle, where sine equals cosine. And internally, there are significant logical, mathematical properties that some triangles are special. And those triangles are, in terms of understanding the whole family of triangles, they represent archetypal ideals. If there is a complete equality, this is why the Trinity has always been symbolized with the equilateral triangle, because each activity by each of the three attributes of the triangle is of equal value. They're all equally important. On the other hand, relative to the material world, a triangle like this is an extremely important triangle. What is it? It's nothing but a knife blade, right? It's extremely significant. It's important. In fact, there are people that study razor blades and know just the best quality of that triangular blade to be able to cut through something and maintain a sharpness and such like that. So there are special cases within the family of objectivity. Because when we're looking, we're not only looking at this eraser, but we're looking at this eraser within a whole family, a whole evolution, because a spiritual idea is a very complex thing. It's multidimensional. It's got all of the different qualities to it that the only way we can study it is in a family of stopped figures. Now, this is much more difficult to do with light. If we're looking at the light of the day at different times of the day, all of these triangles are necessary. In order for any one triangle to exist, the whole family has to exist. The same thing is true with the light of the day. Everything has evolved within this light of the day. You know that if you take a plant and if you deny it the light between 11 and 12 in the morning, you can take any hour that you like, but just take between 11 and 12. That's the one that was done in the experiment. And otherwise, let that plant have the same experience as the plant right next to it, growing under the same conditions. It's just that for 1 hour a day you cover it up. The plant will grow to a height just like the plant next door did it with beans. And it's just that one was missing 1 hour of light a day. At the end of the year, they took the beans from the two plants, and they planted them the next year, and one resulted in a very scrawny plant. And by the third generation, it was a totally defeated thing. From just having done this for one season to the one plant. Terrible thing to do to the plant. But each hour, or the total of the light of the whole day is important. Just like the whole family of triangles are important. But there are special stages that are more important. Like the knife blade gives you an advantage, or a staircase on a given angle gives you another advantage. So, there are significant times in the cycle of light. And the things that we use to represent these significant times or differentiations are given special significations. This is why Koepsel is differentiated and made to be very, very different from Re as the hawk. It's even made to be a separate divinity, Koepsel and then Re Koepsel. And it's used interchangeably throughout the religion of the Egyptians and throughout the whole mystery tradition of the Egyptians. So there is an objective reason for separating things into different gods and having those gods with compound qualities. So when somebody is a mystic and lays out the mythology, or when somebody is a poet and continues that, and they separate and make a distinction between Koepsel and Re Koepsel, there is a reason for that. And it's pretty obvious. I don't know. I've spent a lot of nights staying up all night camping out, and it gets cold. And there's a big difference. Boy, you really, really wait for that sunrise. Because the distinction of the way your body feels according to the warmth of sunrise from the moment before it's rosy and it's lovely, the dawn, the pre-risen sunlight is beautiful, but it isn't warming. There is a distinct difference when the sun crosses the horizon. And that distinct difference has an inner and an outer side to it. I can remember having stayed up one night, all night long, pondering something more actively in my imagination than I had ever done that before. And I was standing out. And it's one of the only times in my life I have ever lost consciousness other than going to sleep. But with the rising sun, I had been pondering these things all night, and I was cold at dawn. And I was standing there, and when the sun rose, I saw that first edge of the sun come, and something, it was like a piston came up my spine, and things vibrated so heavily on my forehead that I lost consciousness. It totally knocked me out. I was spiritually too weak to handle. I had set a process in motion, but was not strong enough to carry it through all the way. And so when there is a God of the rising sun, an energy that drives that sun into the air, and that is given a divine characteristic, it is true. It is very true. I can't doubt that in any other way. I can't doubt that in any way at all. So we have some pictures again, but unfortunately the copy machine doesn't do halftones and quarter tones. But the two objects of our talk tonight, Koepsel and Temu, are in our pictures. So that brings us back to what we're looking at. We're looking at distinct. You laugh. That's right. That's it, exactly. Koepsel is the beetle head. So there is a distinct difference to different times of the day. The shadow is the shortest at noon, and it falls different ways before and after noon. But the big differences are sunrise and sunset. In fact, it's altogether different if you live a day such that you first see the sun rise and then you see it set. That's altogether different than if you get up about 5 in the afternoon and see the sun set and then see it rise. Somebody's written a book about how different it is, the psychology, the very rugged individuality of people who work all night, who see the sun set when they're waking and see it rise when they're going to sleep. They have a totally different side. In fact, they believe that they are, the language that is used by people that work all night long is like the language of people that used to describe the frontier when people were going out west into the wilderness of the unknown. When you have most of your night focused in going into the darkness, and when you very much stand alone and function in the darkness of night, you have that kind of consciousness of being some kind of a pioneer. That's not what we're meaning to talk about. But Khepera, or Ra Khepera, is the beetle-headed god. Specifically, it is a scarab beetle. And so that brings us into all kinds of side tricks, which I don't know if I'm going to be able to hold up to, because getting to the information of the night takes so long that the information is never there. I've come to the conclusion that I do all introductions and I never polish anything off. It's always introduction. But the scarab belongs to a whole family of beetles. And they are all dung beetles. And there are some families that are beneficial to human beings. Like, for example, the lily family. There is no member of the lily family that is poisonous. You know that? There's no poisonous member to it. And they're all beneficial to humanity. In the same way, the esoteric organic gardening books that I read claim that there is no member of the scarab family that is detrimental to any agricultural process. They're human friendly. They are cleansers of other pests, and they're helpful to the whole process of fertilizing. The Egyptians were fascinated with them, totally fascinated them. They're called dung beetles because they lay their eggs, which are so tiny as to be considered invisible, into little scraps of dung. And then they roll the scraps of dung until they get to be balls of dung that are 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter. That big. And the beetle, in order to do this, to push it has to stand on its head. It has to be inverted to push the thing. Then it falls over, the beetle falls over, and it starts all over again. And they're virtually standing on their head, which is very much a Cancerian thing, because Cancer is at the bottom of the zodiac, and everything is upside down and backward, and all the inversion is all of that. And they were considered to have, they eventually find holes that were already there or that they had dug, and then they rolled the ball into the hole, and then the sun, which harmonizes or relates to that ball that the beetle has pushed along, the sun heats it up, and then all the little beetles are born out of it. And this represented to the Egyptians the invisible eggs, at least invisible to the human eye, were like the seminal germinal ideas found in the chaos of Nu, and that the sun shining on them as a spontaneous action and giving birth to new beetles was illustrative of that very principle. The ancients used to think, because there's very little differentiation between a male and a female, they thought that all of the scarabs were males. They thought each and every one of them were males. That's why they were so sacred to the sun. And so this is why the scarab was associated with soul, with the whole idea of anima, something that animates. And this is why in the picture that you saw last week that I gave you, of Ra bent over backwards as the sun. Underneath Ra, pushing Ra up into the morning sky, was a beetle. And so then the beetle represented the animative force, the soul nature, which in the case of the sun was behind it, and which in the case of the dung ball was behind it, pushing it. And it harmonized to the sun so that all of the creation was born out of this inert ball. This was especially important because the whole idea of resurrection, combined with the idea of Re being greater than Nu, had the whole idea of progress built into it. Fertilizer is matter that has been enhanced by the experience of previous life. And so there is, within the dung, there is an improvement so that each day is better than the day before because you've had more experience, you've developed more soul as a consequence of it, and the past is not seen as something sentimental, but the past is seen as fertilizer for a whole new time. The beetle was also the symbol of the soul and represented by Cancer, because Cancer represents the basic feelings that we have. Very often, if you see a person who lies, it seems like coming out of their mouth, there are little vacuous walls, like they're empty light, and they have like little spicules on them, and they almost look like bugs. And when we have instinctual thoughts and instinctual thought forms that we use in a cunning, very self-protective, destructive way, such as the paranoid or the criminal or someone like that, the body or the aura is seething with all of these things. You remember, you've heard the term that somebody went buggy in the mental institute. To this day it's still called the bug house. When one begins to objectify, either through delirium tremens or final separation of the body in a crazy-like state, and they reawaken an atavistic clairvoyance, they see the objectifications of all of their own thoughts, but they materialistically superimpose beetles onto them, and they see them as bugs rather than seeing them just as thought forms. So the bug then, or the beetle in general, represents the kind of subconscious thinking that we have that has all sorts of suspicions. The beetles that the Egyptians used in their ceremonies were made out of green rock. I don't know what the rock was, or it was sometimes a metallic green. The species that was the divine scarab to them, because there are many members in the family, was a green one. They liked the green one. And so you can see then the fact that they were associated with manure, and Khepera was with the rising sun, which was fertile with possibilities and everything, the whole idea of creating something from nothing. Because there was nothing in that dung ball, yet, nothing you could see anyway, but yet new beetles came out of it. And so you can see that there's a whole idea of light having that ability. Now, the Egyptologists have a hard time relating to this, but the Egyptians claim that the beetle also represented the double. And they couldn't understand the double in the sense that we do as the etheric body that actually moves, or vitalizes and gives life to this physical body. And they couldn't understand the beetle standing on its head. Some Egyptologists have become wise, but they've been involved with mysticism. So that if we take the beetle it is associated with Aries, because if you shave a person's head, and if you shave all the way down to the skull, that's the Golgotha point. That is where the soul enters or leaves the physical body, where it comes spiraling in and out. So the relationship, not only as a motive force, but the relationship of the soul to the physical world, or to the light entering the physical world of the sun, coming out of the hole, like the little beetles were born out of these little chuck holes in the ground, is all tied together. It's a very, very integrated kind of symbolism, a very integrated kind of understanding of nature as seen in humans. In fact, they made metallic green beetles that were rimmed on the edges with gold, and they placed them on corpses, and they actually placed them in the mummified hearts of corpses as vehicles for driving the soul in and out of the body. They really got into a lot of funny things. But the whole idea of forward and backward motion, the beetle is actually backed up, standing on its head, moving the ball. And we know that all of the retrospective activity, when we leave our body, either in the tuat at death or when we leave at night, we view our whole life backwards. And the very fertilizer for our whole future existence is in the remembrance of things past that comes from the review of everything that has gone before. So all of this was tied together. So it came to be known as the self-produced, Khepera came to be known as the self-produced or the alone begotten, because each day, through the agency of the double of the beetle, Khepera basically picked himself up by his bootstraps and rose again. And so the twice-born were those that were driven by the gold-lined green beetle that was placed on their heart, and they opened their mouths and they had words of power, and they were then able to ascend. When they ascended, the arc of the sun rising up to the mid-heaven, the ascension of Khepera or Ra Khepera, this was called Mount Baku. However, this gets so fascinating, it just blows you away relative to everything we've talked about earlier in the year. There's another divinity associated with the setting sun. And there is a mountain that is a descending mountain. Do you know what that mountain is called? Mount Manu. And when Re descends from that mountain, he is known as Re Tem, or sometimes just as Temu, or as Atem. which is the Egyptian variant of Adam. In the same way that Set is the brother of Adam, and Atem, Seth, is... all right, I'm going to go into that. Still more fantastic is that in all of Egyptian religion, Tem or Temu or Atem is considered the first manifestation of Ra incarnate, and is considered the father of all humanity. So here we have in Egypt, using the same words, tied together with a totally different conceptology, we have the same ideas all over. This is Swayambhuva all over. The original Adam is Atem, and the original Adam was the first of all of the Manus. That is, all of the archetypal human beings that mark the ladder of descension from the divine, from the archetypal oneness of God down to all the variant stages to becoming humans, and all of these step stages in human, in which some people call root races, of human development. There is a Manu for each of them. I don't know, for me, I get very excited about this. Studying all this Egyptology, I just get blown away that here two cultures, very, very separate from each other, with totally different backgrounds to them, come up with exactly the same thing. Exoterically, we saw before when we talked about entering the Tuat that Temu represented the weakened sun. The weakened sun that was collapsing and falling in on itself. But also, Tem or Temu was the father of humanity, and you can say, just exactly as we have been talking about, in the principle of distribution, the more the spiritual light, the spiritual power that is within the ideas, the more that becomes objectified, the more that becomes concentrated and separated and differentiated, the weaker it becomes. So that there is a reason for being lost and ignorant and feeble as we as human beings are, is because we are very far away from the power of that life. Okay. So we literally, this comes out to be again just like the Platonists said, we literally are living in the land of the dead. You know the ancient Jewish initiates that borrowed from the Egyptians, you know what they used to do? To the setting sun in the west, they used to say, Eva, Eva, Eva. They got the feminine point of view, and they were going to, this was I believe at the new moon, that they yelled this to the divine mother instead of the divine Adam. They yelled this into the setting sun, new moon sun. So the gender switch has something, I think, to do with the cycle of Ra, because we actually have two cycles. If you remember, 2 years ago we were talking about the Eleusinian mysteries that were celebrated in the woods outside of Athens, near the little tiny village of Elysius, which came to be quite a big part. It's now part of Athens. And that one of the unique things of the Eleusinian mysteries was that there were two tracks, and that they were run simultaneously. That there was an esoteric activity and an exoteric activity going on side by side. So that at one hand you could have somebody that would be partying away, and right next to them might be a Plato that was unfolding clairvoyance in the same activity. And we're seeing the same thing side by side. This led to a very subtle two-track type of consciousness. Oh boy, how to get to all of this. All of this two-track consciousness is a result of our fall into matter. Jung is perfectly right when he says that symbols were born as a result of the division of consciousness of human beings between an unconscious and a conscious state. And that the symbol represents a gateway so that in the consciousness, which is really unconsciousness, which is in the land of separation, in the land of materialism, one of the ways we can get at the invisible, apparently unknown understandings of the meanings behind this is by looking through a symbol into the unconscious, which for us is the spiritual worlds. Now, this dichotomy between our outward consciousness, which we pride as being reality, and the inward consciousness, which sometimes we call unreal, the ancients would have seen it just the other way around. They would have said the inward consciousness was the real, and this is the unreal and the illusion. But if this division becomes too great, it becomes very dangerous. Because, we've said it before, symbols conceal as much as they reveal. And we're then subject to partial truths that can get you into a lot of trouble. That's what actually happened with our destruction of the environment. We look for short-term advantages. We have a little bit of knowledge and we disrupt things by carrying the process of distribution so far that we cut things off from the unity of life in the whole. And when we do that, we produce death. And we produce deathly conditions that kill human beings as well as other things. It also results in a phoniness. We live in a completely artificial world. There are some people, if you cut one wire, their in touch with reality is lost. They have no electricity and they can't do anything anymore. And they live totally in a world of artificiality that is totally external, and even the understandings are external. One of the manifestations of this is, since we cunningly function from within, if we can make the appearances look one way and have a different meaning, we can get away with more. And it becomes a lie. Interesting, the consequence of the second sin against the Holy Ghost is a result of the first sin against the Holy Ghost. In the Adam and Eve story, the first sin against the Holy Ghost was disobediently and ignorantly abusing the creative force for our own personal pleasure. So sexual abuse is the Old Testament sin against the Holy Ghost. It has driven us dangerously into matter so that we have this divided two-track consciousness carried to extreme, so that when we read, like in Matthew's Gospel in Christianity, the sin against the Holy Ghost is lying. And that is a consequence of the phoniness, that we can give one external reason for something or one external statement of something and internally be meaning something altogether different. And ultimately, if we have this division between the appearances that we produce outwardly, where not only our clothes, but everything in the external world becomes a fashion statement or a style statement, and we neglect the culture of the inner being. We produce the ultimate split, the ultimate two-track, which is insanity and separation from the whole process. The second death, which is a much greater death than the death that we experienced by being cut off, by having a partition placed between the inner and outer worlds. When we're in the outer world, we're afraid to die because because of all the lies we're told coming from the inner world. But the second death is much greater if we identify ourselves with the phony outwardness and go with it, so that there's complete malnutrition of the spirit, and it has to go back to the one in an unclothed state. That second death is a much more dangerous kind of death. I didn't want to talk about all this, but it's germane, and it's completing the thoughts that I couldn't complete when I was making the notes, because I was racing along saying, how am I ever going to get this said in one talk? And I'm not going to get it said. I'm not going to get it all said in one talk, unless I talk faster yet. The positive side of this two-track view is that it leads to the subtlety that is born of dualism. The opposition aspect has that same kind of division, but it produces very, very great subtlety. And that subtlety itself, from the two, seeing it from your point of view and seeing it from another point of view, leads to the possibility of seeing it from a third point of view, where both other views are taken in as one. And this is where true spiritual selfness is born. Remember the pout of Hermopolis. Everybody was divided into opposite pairs, and out of that, the one was born. This is a very, very, very deep subject. It's one of the sermons of Buddha, the Surangama Sutra, where Buddha talks about the perceived, the perceiver, and the perception, and how the total is born out of that. So that if we have this two-tracked Eleusinian type of quality, where we have a subject inside that is a perceiver, and an object outside that is perceived, and then an awareness of both self and of object in a kind of objectivity, and that the two are connected, that leads to a third point of view from which the I in the triangle is born, which is a total kind of consciousness, which is indeed the true seership, which is the kind of oneness. So it really is literally like the Pythagoreans counting from 1 to 10. If you can get to 3, that's enough. If you can see that there's something out there, and that you can see that there's something in there seeing that out there, and that you can see that you're seeing it, you're there. It's just that simple. It's like seeing the whole family of triangles at the same time, or seeing the triangle from all points of view at the same time. You have reached a one state that it works with all of the differential divisions. So, we can now see that when we talked about entering the Tuat, which is, from this point of view, the underworld, the world that is underneath this physical world, that there were two boats in there. And those two boats were vehicles. The Semtet boat and the Matet boat were vehicles of entering into the underworld and coming back out of them. And they were vehicles that combined having a subjective and an objective consciousness at the same time, and that when you switched boats from one to the other and covered the same territory coming back from the other direction, you attained to the total type of consciousness so that you could be twice born. Once born in this material sense and the awareness of yourself as a separate individuality, and then twice born in the birth of the universal consciousness, knowing that you were a part of the all-one. In the mundane outer sense, Khepra represented a fertility symbol. The rising sun to this day is associated with a sauna house, with a massage parlor downtown, and the famous house of prostitution was called the House of the Rising Sun. In this same outward track, Mount Manu then is associated with the feeble, has-been mortal, who is fallen man. And he's lost all of his best qualities. Now, the stream that runs between Mount Manu and Mount Baku is a stream. And if you remember from 2 years ago, this is terrible the way this. And next year it'll be, do you remember from 4 years ago we were talking about this? It's been one long continuous. I sometimes believe that my kid. Can you imagine that my panorama after I die is I'm going to have to listen to everything I said, and I'll have to say, oh my God, did he say all of that? And then I'll have to say, oh my God, how much of it was untrue? I hope not too much. I found a few errors here and there, but I've corrected. But that river is the melted river of the water from the watery abyss of Nu. But that river is also the universal river that we call the River Nile when we were talking about Isis, Osiris, and Horus. It's sometimes called Oceanus and sometimes Eridanus, and sometimes it is called, what is the big river in India? Ganges, Ganga. The river Ganga. Ganga, I guess it would be. Remember that if you went downstream in the universal river, you became human. And if you went upstream, you became divine. So we're seeing that there's two senses here. And you remember, we've talked about this before, that entrance into this world at all came by 2 gates. And those gates were like the pylons that were at the beginning and end of the river that ran through the Tuat. In fact, there were 12 different sets of pylons. In the Indo-European sense, the gates are called, instead of the eastern and western, they're called the northern and southern gates. The northern gate was associated with the Tropic of Cancer. It was called the Gate of Cancer, and it was associated with the beetle. The southern gate was associated with the sea goat, Capricorn. And that's part of an Egyptian story. That at one time Set, Typhoon, scared all of the gods when they were just basking away and they had thrown off their clothes, meaning thrown off all of their divine attributes, and they were caught naked and they couldn't defend themselves, and they all transformed into different animals. And, I don't remember that. All right. That's because she was a virgin. Venus turned herself into a fish and swam away underwater, And Hermes turned himself into an ibis and stood above the water, and Zeus turned himself into a ram and raced off. But Saturn, I forget the name of their Saturn, turned himself into a sea goat so that he could be protected in the water, but that he could have an eye to what was going on land. That sort of chary, wary, very cunning consciousness of Capricorn. Humans enter this world through the northern gate, through this gate of subjectivity, through Cancer, through the womb. And they rise slowly to the southern gate, to the objectivity and the divine character of Capricorn. And Capricorn ushers out the bones. That's all that are left, because Capricorn, Saturn Capricorn, then is seen as the grim reaper that is just a skeleton. This is the stream that goes from midsummer to midwinter. This is an upstream struggle. The whole human condition is to go upstream and against the grain, because that is what produces divinity. The gods, on the other hand, take the other stream. They enter by the realm of Capricorn. They have the objective consciousness. They come from the realms of intelligibility, and they sacrifice themselves, and they go downstream, and they become more and more subjective as they are more and more deeply distributed. Always they're being led onward to the eternal feminine that is the watery abyss of the new. And so they go downstream and they come to greater humanity and greater humility from midwinter to midsummer. This is a very simplistic statement of a very profound cycle of the whole of the consciousness coming from the germ of spirituality out into the world and back. And this stream, it's very much like what we give out to the world is what comes back to us. The thing that connects us as twofold beings, that we might call it the law of cause and consequence, but it is the law of connection. That the more we give of ourselves and sacrifice like the gods, the more we can consume of the world. The Egyptians had very curious notions about this. They claimed that when Re and the other gods in Tuat entered into the Tuat, that they lived off of the voices of their dead enemies and of their lost souls, and out of the prayers of the living, or of the dead human beings, the living for the dead human beings. So in all cases, the gods lived off the voices of their enemies, the voices of demons, the voices of prayers from the dead. If we remember the story of Narcissus and Echo, that Echo became thinner and thinner and thinner until she was only a voice, because she had worshipped her body so much, she had fallen in love. Or the story of the Cumaean Sibyls, they did a great favor to Zeus at one time, and he asked them whatever they wanted, and they each reached into the ground and into the sand, and they picked up a hand of sand, and they said, "We want to live as many years as there are grains of sand in our hands." And they kept getting older and older and more shriveled up and more shriveled up, until they became so tiny that only their voices existed. The voice is the same as the echo of Echo. That when Re and the other gods dive into the Tuat to dive on the serpent Apep, and fight with it. It is seeing this whole cycle of giving ourselves in battle to the good fight, to entering into the realm of darkness, of the unknown, into space, and taking out of that, not the space itself, because even the gods can't take it with them when they go, but they take only the voice, only the echo, because everything began as a word, and the gods are nurtured as a word, because when the echo comes back and it is carried into the whole creation, it carries with it the soul and the essence that of all of the experience it had with it. It's really a beautiful thing, because the voice is the one thing that doesn't lie. Because there can't be a lie entering into the material world. You can learn much more by listening to the tone of a person's voice than you can from the content of it many times, because a person is, the hardest thing in the world is to talk about yourself. But it's the easiest thing to do, because anything you say, you're talking about yourself. You're telling that whole truth. On the other hand, human beings were told to rise to the divine state because their life and their divinity came by eating the gods. And so when we consume the intelligibility of the divine, and what we swim, we're like trout. We go upstream and we're eating instead of eating little aphids and things like that, what we eat is we eat the body of God, and in that we become uplifted by it. So the diving of Ray as a hawk become Tem into the underworld is a process of light going into the darkness and coming back as an echo. And this indicates 3 stages of actually what swimming upstream is like, or what the process of becoming a twice-born is like. Because the manifestation of the religion of light, in the first stage, you throw light into things. And when you do, you see what was already there. So the stage where we are at, we are very fortunate if we can see the reality of things as they are. Where instead of reading a book like the Cosmo Conception that tells us there's a big difference between the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, and you see a cardinal and a tree, boy, you really know that. And you can see that they have very different existences. And the more we become enlightened, the more we can see of what is there. The second stage of the religion of light is when we actually create out of the light. Because the light doesn't illumine what was there as a potential within chaos or within the absolute. The light projects itself, and Capricorn-like sacrifices of itself and gives itself. And so the second stage in the religion of light or of the illumination is to create and to make tangible things out of the light. It becomes the ultimate creative essence, where our concentrations, where we can actually make things become out of our concentrations. And the third stage of the light is to become the light itself. And when we reach that third stage of the religion of light, we become like Ray, the creator, the self-creator of light, and we create the very thing that makes creation possible. That's a very, very distant thing from us, but that is where we are going, and that is what we're trying to get at. Okay, so then we see that in the second track, you see at the same time there's our everyday cycle. And behind that, is a representation of the spiritual cycle of spirit coming into matter, and not just the ongoing cycle where we improve ourselves, by rising in the material world and having all our little petty ambitions, which are important. But in that second sense, the realm of the dead is the underworld, and it is the underworld that is the spiritual world. And in that sense, the Book of the Dead is not the book of corpses or of departed souls. If you look at everything in the Book of the Dead, the weighing of the soul, and all of those things, they are all stages in initiation. The Book of the Dead is not a bunch of superstitions about caring for a dead body. It is a book of becoming a twice-born, of rising in the spiritual worlds in the same way that Khepera rises in the material world. But back to Manu. We're just about done here, I think. Yeah. We got just a very, very few things. Back to Tem of Manu. The two-track esoteric-exoteric model not only promotes subtlety, but as we said before, it makes possible the all-conscious, so that we can see the angels both descending and ascending on the Son of humanity. And it telescopes. It telescopes the whole form of the primordial atom falling into distribution and differentiation into the world. It telescopes that all on the whole process of humans descending into matter, and it telescopes it with the whole process of what we do every time we think and we carry something out. So everything in our daily life, I'm going to tell myself this tomorrow when I try to drag myself out of bed, I get to relive the entire cycle of the creation again today, if I get out of bed, that is. And so it's that whole kind of thing. Another thing about the two-track quality that is indicated by Tem in the West is that both cycles exist quotaneously and they counter each other. Just like in the sacred dramas of the ancients, they used to have the chorus, that one chorus was turning one way and the other chorus was going the other way, and they counterbalanced each other. The strophes and antistrophes balanced each other out, and that's what makes possible the neutralization. This is a tremendously large principle, and I'm just going to state that it's there because we don't have it all time to go into it. But in seeing the opposites not as working against each other, but seeing them as two counterbalancing cycles is the way to come to ultimate unity and to keep yourself in a state of perfect equipoise so that you can be acting on two very disparate directions at the same time and not be tearing yourself apart by trying to do two opposite things, but by having them as balancing. It's like having an engine where there is a crankshaft spinning one way, but at the same time that there's a counter crankshaft spinning the other way, so that there's never any loss of balance. This is one of the things that gives the equipoise to the earth that we live in, because if it were only a one revolution quality, we could not have the consciousness. See, I don't know how to say this. This is ultimately important to everything that we do in evolution now. Because in the first half of evolution, the predominance goes with the forward spinning. Everything goes deeper and deeper into matter. We have passed the center point of that, And we have passed that center point of it in our careers as human beings. So that now we take the echo or the voice out by starting a voluntary upstream unspinning. And that's what retrospection is, and that's why it's so hard, is because we're unspinning. It's always easy about what we think we're going to do tomorrow and to have all kinds of plans like that, but to withdraw the essence of everything that we have done by doing a backward retrospection day by day, we are sacrificing by setting the counterspin going the other direction. Because from here on in, yes, we become more creative. Everything that we are, our emotions find greater fulfillment, our actions find greater fulfillment, and they continue to go forward. But they go forward at the same time that we draw the soul material out of all of our previous actions, and it is that soul material that gives the forward-moving activities that we do the strength and the energy to become as they become. So if we have the ability to see the counter cycles, the river that's running downstream and upstream, and if we can see that there is in the rising sun a fertility and at the same time a new look at darkness, if we can see both of these at the same time, we have become divine. Until then, if we choose to work with the day in the day and then voluntarily unwind at night, that's as good of a beginning as we can get. Other things that come, especially with the long culture that the Egyptians had that extended, as we said, 250,000 years, and where they saw all of these cycles and had records of cycles going that Julius Firmicus Maternus says that the Egyptians had astronomical records going back 200,000 years. And Firmicus Maternus was capable of going to the Library of Alexandria to find that out for himself. He was living in that period. And I don't know how to say this, but when you are in touch, I have a friend that has actually done this and has gone to the same spot of nature, exactly the same spot at the same time of the day, looking in the same direction at the same objects once for each sign of the zodiac. And you see how the plants burst out, just like they do in these paintings out here, and then they close over with the same cycle of expanding outward and giving, and then turning inward and preparing for new creation. You see it happen in all of the plants, even the plants at the end of the year, everything droops over like that. But if we have the ability for understanding one day or 1 year, we have the ability for understanding the sun cycle. But if we go through day after day after day and follow this cycle after cycle after cycle with the progressiveness that comes from us, it draws us into understanding the cycle extended in another direction or in another dimension in eternity. So that if we see cycle after cycle, it doesn't have to become boring, same old stuff again day after day after day. The cyclical approach to things, especially when you have the two-track cycle and counter-cycle, each day you see a little more in it. Each day you can live life a little better. But each day it becomes a deeper and a more profound conception of eternity that you have because you see the cycle in another dimension. Finally, the analogy principle that ties all of these things together, expands everything, all of the cycles, and extends it through time, gives us a magnification of things in terms of space. That if we can understand eternity and the eternal life cycle in one day, or we can see one day From one day we can see the eternal going back and forth both ways. That produces an enormous expansion through the principle of analogy. The telescope not only brings it such that we can see the large cycle coincident with the smallest of cycles that we experience, it also expands out so that through the principle of analogy, this diameter or this ray from the circle can be extended so that we can understand the eternity of space also. All right, we've looked a little bit then at the trinity of light, of Ra, Khepera, and Tem. We have about 3 other triads of Re that we want to look at. Remember, this is Egypt, and we're going to do it just like the Egyptians do. We're going to look at many, many, many triads, and in each one we're going to see Re, and we're going to see reality a little different. Some of these we're going to go on very big side trips. And we'll end up with the triad of Re, Tem, Re, Shu, and Tefnut, where we began out of the creation, and from there we'll go into the Pout of Heliopolis, and we'll get into the hierarchy things. And that brings us to one last little closing. I can't quit tonight. The Temu was lord of Anu, the city of Anu. And the city of Anu was right near Cairo. In fact, the Cairo was overgrown it now. They've dug it out. And Tem ruled there. This is what was called the famous Heliopolis. This was the most glorious for all of its temples, and the richness and power that pervaded all of Egypt, and all of the ancient world wanted to know of the wonder that was Anu. It was here that all of humanity was born out of Ra-Tem, out of Nu. And it was here that all of the divine kings were born. And the divine kings had a whole bunch of names. One of them was the king of the north and the south, because the Egyptians carried their principle of analogy so far that there were 2 separate kingdoms, one of the north and one of the south, and each kingdom had pouts with capitals that related to the same divinities. So there was the as above, so below quality. And the divine kings who were born, we'll have to hold off on that, it'll get to be too much. The divine kings were the kings of 2 Uachets. Those are those 2 eyes that you see, the eyes of night and the eyes of day. And all the divine kings were also called the son of Set, because they never denied the fact that they belonged to nature. And Set represented the passive qualities of nature as well as all of the Seth qualities. All of the divine kings were also sons of the sun. And in a strange way, all of the divine kings were called sons of Horus. Even though Horus existed before Tem, Tem was the father of Horus. And Horus was the avenging son, the son reborn. But Horus was the initiate. This is one of my favorite stories because it just has me absolutely in awe. And this was part of a public ceremony that the divine king, who was an initiate king, was put through all of these many, many, many trials, moral trials, physical trials, intellectual trials, and literally lived out the Book of the Dead, and then in a public ceremony was made the son of Horus. And what he did is he reached into the sky, and he took the sun out of the sky, and he put it in his forehead. and he said, "This is the I of God. I am the Son of God." And when he said that, that I belonged to God. It was God's I, and he could only use it for the service of God. And so, in the same way that in our modern mysteries we're all facing the West, except for me, I have to sacrifice and face the East. In the West is where we pick ourselves up spiritually by our bootstraps, and we make our own light out of the darkness. All of the divine sons of Temu, who were the divine sons of Horus, brought the eye of God out of themselves, but it was always God's eye. And that's it. Yes.